If you enjoy stories that feel real, touch your heart, and leave you thinking long after they end, then you're in the right place. Welcome to Mr. Wisdom Stories. 6 months after his divorce, Smith was sitting at a small restaurant in Dallas with 2 co-workers when someone asked him the question he had answered so many times that he no longer had to think about it. "What happened between you and Viola?" Smith took a sip of his coffee. "She left. Just like that?" Smith gave a small shrug. "She decided she didn't want the marriage anymore. And the house? I kept it. And the furniture? Most of it." "What did she take?" Smith leaned back in his chair. "Not much. Clothes, her laptop, a few personal things." His co-worker nodded. "So she really walked away with almost nothing?" Smith smiled. "She left with what she came with." Another person at the table asked something Smith hadn't expected. "Then why didn't she fight for anything?" Smith's smile faded for a second. He looked down at his coffee, then back up. "Because she knew what she was doing." He paused. "She didn't want the house, didn't want the furniture, didn't want to make things ugly." "So you think she just accepted the loss?" Smith shrugged. "I guess." What neither man at that table knew was that Viola had never believed she had lost. And what Smith didn't know was that the woman he described as leaving with nothing had spent the final weeks of their marriage quietly keeping records of the things he no longer wanted to discuss. Not because she was preparing revenge or planning to expose him. She was simply trying to make sure that when the marriage ended, she knew exactly where she stood. Welcome to Mr. Wisdom Stories. Unexpected turns, and the things we sometimes learn too late. Let's begin. The strange part of Smith's story wasn't that he kept repeating it. It was that people believed him. Viola never corrected him. She didn't call his friends. She didn't send anyone copies of bank statements. She didn't explain how many household responsibilities she had carried while they were married. She didn't list the bills she had paid or the decisions she had tried to discuss with him. She simply moved into a smaller apartment in Dallas and started rebuilding her life. At first, that silence cost her. She heard what Smith had been saying and felt her jaw tighten. There were nights when she considered sending someone a message, just one message that would make the record clear, something that would remind people that being the lower earner didn't mean she had contributed nothing. But every time she came close, she stopped, because there was a question she kept asking herself. What would I actually gain? That question became more important than proving Smith wrong. Then, several months later, Smith saw Viola again. It happened at a professional event in Dallas. He hadn't known she would be there. He was standing near the back of the room when he heard her laugh. He turned. For a moment he didn't recognize her. She looked comfortable. Viola was speaking with 2 people about a professional course she had completed. She held a paper cup in one hand. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't looking across the room for Smith. She hadn't even noticed him. He watched her for several seconds. Then she turned. Their eyes met. Viola gave him a polite smile. "Hi, Smith." "Hi." A pause. "How have you been?" "I'm good." He nodded. "Work going okay?" "Yeah, better than okay." She smiled. That bothered him more than he expected. He had simply expected the woman who had left his house carrying 2 suitcases to look more uncertain. Instead, she looked settled. They spoke for a few minutes. Then Smith asked the question he had been carrying for months. "You never told anyone what happened, did you?" Viola looked at him. "You were telling your version." Smith swallowed. "I know." Another pause. "Didn't it bother you?" She knew what he meant. "People thinking you left with nothing?" Viola looked down at the cup in her hand. For the first time that evening, the smile disappeared. "Yes." Smith looked surprised. "Then why didn't you say anything?" Viola took a breath. "I thought about it. I figured. I could have explained a lot of things." Smith didn't answer. She continued. "I could have shown people records. I could have explained what I contributed. I could have told them what really happened inside that house." Smith looked uncomfortable. "Why didn't you?" Viola looked at him. "Because I finally realized something." "What?" She didn't answer immediately. And that silence was the first moment Smith understood that he had misunderstood her departure. Because Viola hadn't walked away without a fight. She had walked away from a fight she no longer believed she needed to win. But there was still one thing Smith didn't know. He didn't know what Viola had kept. He didn't know what the records showed. And he certainly didn't know why, after everything that had happened between them, she was willing to let him keep telling people that she had left with nothing. That answer would force Smith to look at their marriage differently, and perhaps even more painfully, it would force him to look at himself. Before Smith and Viola became the couple people later talked about, they were simply two people trying to build a life together in Dallas. Smith was 36, Viola was 29. They had been married for 2 years and 4 months, which was long enough to know each other's habits, but still short enough that they remembered how carefully they had once chosen each other. Their 3-bedroom house wasn't luxurious. It sat in a neighborhood where people worked hard, paid their bills, and knew that being comfortable was not the same thing as being wealthy. Smith liked the house because it felt practical. Viola liked it because it felt like theirs. That difference would matter later. At the beginning, there was very little to suggest that anything would go seriously wrong. Smith worked in commercial property management. He was good at his job because he liked numbers, contracts, payment schedules, and knowing exactly what needed to happen next. Viola worked in operations for a small medical services company. Her work wasn't glamorous, but it demanded patience. She remembered renewal dates, she kept track of bills. She knew when the car needed an oil change. She knew which insurance policy covered what. She knew when the electricity bill had gone up, and somehow she always remembered Smith's mother's birthday. Smith used to notice those things. One evening he came through the front door, dropped his keys on the kitchen counter, and found Viola looking through a stack of household papers. He watched her for a moment. "You know you don't have to organize everything tonight." She didn't look up. "If I don't do it tonight, I'll forget." "You're the only person I know who can make paying a water bill look like a project." Viola laughed. "That's because you think everything can wait until tomorrow." "It usually can." "No, it usually can't." Smith smiled. She finally looked at him. "What?" "Nothing." "Why are you looking at me like that?" "I just don't know how you remember all this stuff." Viola picked up another paper. "Somebody has to." Smith laughed. "Fair enough." Those were the kinds of evenings they had. Nothing extraordinary. They ordered takeout sometimes. They cooked when they had the energy. They watched television on Saturday nights. They argued over small things and occasionally apologized before going to bed. Smith could be stubborn. Viola could be overly cautious. Neither of them was particularly good at admitting when the other had a point. But they loved each other. At least they believed they did. Before they married, Smith had already purchased a small investment property. It wasn't some enormous real estate empire. It was simply a property he believed could become a reliable source of income if he managed it properly. He talked about it often. "This could help us later," he told Viola one night. They were sitting at the kitchen table with dinner between them. Viola looked up. "Later when?" "When we're older." She smiled. "So you're already planning our retirement?" "I'm planning ahead." "You've always liked doing that. Is that a complaint?" "No." She paused. "I actually like it." Smith smiled. "See? We're good for each other." Viola nodded. "I think we are." At that point, she genuinely believed it. She respected his ambition. He respected her ability to keep their everyday life organized. The investment property didn't frighten her. What concerned her was how much money Smith wanted to put into it. One evening he told her about repairs that needed to be made. "I think we should put more into the property now," he said. Viola set down her fork. "How much?" "I'm still working through the numbers." "That means you don't know yet." "I know enough." She watched him. "Smith, I'm not saying don't do it. I know. I just think we should build the emergency fund first." He leaned back. "Why?" "Because if something happens, I don't want us depending on the property to rescue us." Smith gave a small laugh. "You always think something is going to happen." "No, I just like knowing what we'll do if it does." He shook his head. "Sometimes you worry too much." Viola smiled faintly. "And sometimes you don't worry enough." Neither of them knew it then, but that small disagreement contained the beginning of a much larger problem. Smith saw caution as a lack of confidence. Viola saw preparation as part of being responsible. For the moment, though, they simply finished dinner. Later that night, Smith kissed her forehead before going to bed. Viola turned off the kitchen light. Their house was quiet. Their marriage still felt ordinary. And that was precisely why neither of them noticed how easily two people who loved each other could begin keeping score without realizing it. The first disagreement about the investment property was easy to forget. The second one wasn't. Smith had spent several weeks looking into the repairs the property needed. He came home with figures, estimates, and a confidence that made Viola suspect he had already made up his mind. One Saturday morning he spread several papers across the dining table. "I talked to the contractor again." Viola was pouring coffee. "How much?" "It's not finalized." "That wasn't my question." Smith looked at her. "Somewhere around 15,000. Viola stopped pouring. 15? Maybe. Smith, I said maybe. She put the coffee pot down. And how much is in our emergency savings right now? He leaned back. Why are you doing that? Doing what? Turning everything into a financial interrogation? Viola stared at him. I'm asking you a question. I know. Then answer it. Smith sighed. About 18. Viola nodded slowly. So if you put 15,000 into the property, we're not putting 15,000 into it. But you just said, I said the repairs could cost that much. She folded her arms. Then what are you planning to do? I'll figure it out. That isn't a plan. It is until I have the final numbers. Viola looked at the papers. I'm not telling you not to repair the property. Then what are you telling me? I want us to protect ourselves first. Smith pushed one of the papers aside. Viola, this property is an investment. And we're people. He looked at her. She continued more quietly. Investments don't matter much if we don't have enough cash when something goes wrong. Smith shook his head. You always assume something will go wrong. No, I assume life doesn't ask permission before things go wrong. For a moment, Smith said nothing. Then he smiled without humor. You know what? Sometimes I think you're afraid of success. Viola blinked. Afraid of success? You want everything safe before we do anything. Because we're married, that doesn't mean we have to live scared. I don't. You sound like you do. She took a slow breath. I trust you, Smith. I just don't want trust to mean I stop asking questions. That sentence stayed with him. Not because he agreed, because he didn't. From that point on, Smith began hearing her questions differently. When Viola asked how much something cost, he heard doubt. When she asked whether a decision had been finalized, he heard criticism. When she asked whether they could afford something, he heard resistance. And Viola began noticing that every financial conversation required preparation. She would think about how to phrase a question. She would wait until Smith was in a good mood. Sometimes she decided it wasn't worth bringing up at all. That was her mistake. Not because she was responsible for Smith's reactions, but because avoiding difficult conversations didn't make the underlying problem disappear. One evening, they were discussing a new piece of furniture for the living room. Smith mentioned that he wanted a particular sofa. Viola looked at the price. That's more than I expected. Smith's face changed. You don't like it? That's not what I said. You don't have to like everything I choose, I know. Then what's the issue? The price. He leaned against the counter. I can afford it. Viola nodded. I know you can. Then why are we having this conversation? Because we're married. Smith looked away. A few seconds passed. Then he said, Sometimes you make everything sound like it belongs to both of us. Viola didn't understand. Because we're married? That's not what I mean. Then what do you mean? He didn't answer. The conversation ended there, but the words stayed with her. A few weeks later, they were sitting at the dining table reviewing household expenses. Viola had a pen in her hand. Smith was looking through a statement. He suddenly said, Everything you see here is because I paid for it. Her pen stopped. She looked up. Everything? Smith sighed. You know what I'm saying. No, I don't. I earn more. I know. I've carried most of the financial responsibility. You've earned more, Viola said. That's different. Smith's jaw tightened. I didn't say you don't contribute. You just said everything here is because you paid for it. I was frustrated. That doesn't make it untrue. I didn't say it was untrue. Viola placed the pen on the table. I've paid bills too. I know. I've handled the insurance. I know. I've kept track of things you forget. I know, Viola. Then why say it like none of that matters? Smith looked at her. I wasn't trying to diminish you. She nodded. I believe you. But her voice had changed, and that was the problem. Smith didn't think he had done anything serious. Viola didn't think he had intended to hurt her. Yet something had shifted. The house still looked the same. The furniture was still where it had always been. Their marriage still existed. But the word ours was beginning to disappear from the way Smith spoke, and Viola was beginning to wonder how long she could pretend not to notice. The conversation about the money happened on a Tuesday evening. Viola had just finished washing the last plate when Smith walked into the kitchen with his phone in his hand. I took care of the property payment. Viola dried her hands. What payment? Smith looked at the screen. The contractor deposit. How much? He hesitated. 12,000. Viola stared at him. $12,000? Yes. From where? Smith didn't answer immediately. She already knew. Our savings? I was going to tell you. When? I was going to explain it tonight. You already moved it. I had to. Viola turned off the kitchen faucet. Smith, we talked about this. I know. No, you heard me. That's different. He put his phone on the counter. The contractor needed the deposit. And you couldn't call me? I didn't have time to have another argument. Viola looked at him. So you made the decision because you didn't want to discuss it with me. That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said. Smith rubbed his forehead. Viola, I knew you'd say no. Did I say no? You were going to. You don't know that. I know how this conversation goes. She stood there quietly for a moment. Then she asked, How much is left? 6,000. Viola looked toward the counter. $6,000. That was all they had left in the emergency fund after Smith had moved $12,000 without telling her. She picked up her phone. What are you doing? Checking the bills. You don't trust me? This isn't about trust. It sounds like it. No, she said. This is exactly about trust. Smith's expression hardened. I was trying to protect our future, and I was trying to protect our present. I know what I'm doing. I know you believe that. He stared at her. What is that supposed to mean? It means you keep making decisions first and explaining them afterward. I told you I was handling it. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Smith looked away. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then he said, You make me feel like I can't do anything right. Viola's face softened slightly. That isn't what I want, but that's how it feels. I don't want you to feel that way. Then trust me. I do trust you. Then stop questioning everything. Viola shook her head. Trust doesn't mean I stop having a voice. Smith didn't respond. She looked at the phone again. We have bills coming out this week. I know. Car insurance, I know. Electricity, I know. Mortgage, I know, Viola. She looked at him. Then why would you leave us with $6,000? Because the property needs the work, and if something happens to one of us, we'll handle it. How? Smith didn't answer. That was the first time Viola noticed something she couldn't explain away. He had an answer for the investment. He had an answer for the contractor. He had an answer for why he moved the money. But when she asked what they would do if the plan failed, he had nothing. Smith picked up his phone. I don't want to fight. Neither do I. Then let's drop it. Viola looked at him. I can't. Why? Because this isn't just about $12,000. Smith sighed. Here we go. No. Listen. She stepped closer. I'm not asking you to stop investing. I'm asking you to stop making decisions that affect both of us by yourself. I said I'll be more careful. When? What? When will you be more careful? Before the next decision or after? Smith looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked toward the bedroom. I'm tired. The bedroom door closed. Viola remained in the kitchen. She didn't cry, she didn't shout. She simply stood there with her phone in her hand. After a moment, she opened the banking app. She checked the balance again. Then she opened the household budget. She checked the upcoming payments. Everything still worked on paper, but the margin was smaller, much smaller. Viola sat at the dining table, the same table where they had once planned vacations, the same table where Smith had told her that everything around them existed because he paid for it. She stared at the numbers. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about how to convince him. She was thinking about what she needed to understand for herself. She opened a folder on her laptop. She began saving account statements, then receipts, then insurance information, then household records. Nothing dramatic, nothing secret, just documentation. She wasn't preparing to destroy her marriage. She wasn't planning to expose Smith. She wasn't even certain the marriage would end. She simply wanted to know where they stood. That distinction mattered, because Viola still hoped they could fix things. She still loved him. She still believed people could make mistakes and repair them. But that night, sitting alone beneath the kitchen light, she finally understood something she had been avoiding. The problem wasn't $12,000. The problem was that Smith had started making decisions as though the marriage required her agreement only after the decision had already been made, and Viola had started accepting that pattern because confronting it felt exhausting. She closed the laptop. The house was quiet. Smith was in the bedroom. For several minutes she sat without moving. Then she whispered to herself, I can't keep doing this. She wasn't talking about the money, she was talking about the marriage. She just didn't know it yet. For the next few weeks nothing dramatic happened. That was almost worse. Smith went to work every morning. Viola went to her office. They bought groceries, paid bills, and occasionally sat together at the end of the day to watch television. If anyone had visited the house, they might have thought the marriage was fine, but the small conversations had changed. One Saturday, Smith came into the kitchen while Viola was checking the household budget. "What are you working on?" "Bills." He opened the refrigerator. "You don't have to check everything every week." "I know. You've been doing that a lot lately." "Because we have less in savings than we did before." "I know. Then I think it's reasonable." Smith took out a bottle of water. "The property will make up for it." Viola wanted to ask when. She didn't. Instead, she said, "Okay." Smith looked at her. "That's it? What do you want me to say?" "Nothing." He walked out. Viola waited until he was gone before looking at the account again. She wasn't trying to control him. She was trying to understand what was happening to them. A week later, Smith came home with a new office chair. Viola noticed immediately. "How much was that?" Smith put his briefcase down. "300. Okay." That sounded like a question. "It was. I needed it." "I didn't say you didn't," he sighed. "You don't have to approve every purchase I make. I didn't ask you to ask permission." "Then why did you ask?" "Because we're trying to rebuild the savings you used for the property." Smith's expression tightened. "I told you the property is going to pay us back. And I hope it does." "You don't sound like you do." "I do." "Then trust me." Viola looked at him. "I am trying." Argument would have. "You know what? Forget it." He walked toward the hallway. Viola didn't follow. That was becoming another pattern. When conversations became uncomfortable, one of them left. When questions became difficult, the other stopped asking. And because neither wanted to admit how much distance that created, the house remained quiet enough to look peaceful. One evening, Smith came home later than usual. Viola was sitting at the dining table. "You ate?" "Yeah. There's food in the fridge. I'll have it later." He noticed the papers beside her. "What are those?" "Insurance documents. You don't need to worry about that. I already handle the insurance. I mean the property insurance." Viola looked up. "Did you change something?" Smith hesitated. "It's being handled." "By who?" "I said it's being handled." She waited. "Smith." "What? Did you change the policy?" He looked irritated. "I'll explain it when I have everything sorted." "That isn't an answer." "It will be." He walked toward the bedroom. Viola watched him disappear. Then she looked down at the documents. For the first time, the house felt less like a place where two people were building something together and more like a place where each person was protecting separate interests. She didn't want that. But wanting partnership didn't automatically create it. That night, Viola opened the folder on her laptop. She added the latest account statement. Then she stopped. She thought about Smith. About the man who once laughed when she organized their bills. About the man who once told her they were good for each other. She wasn't sure when "we" had become so difficult for him to say, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending the change was temporary. The following Sunday, they attended a family gathering as planned. Smith was relaxed around everyone else. When someone asked how the marriage was going, he smiled. "We're doing okay." Viola smiled too. She didn't correct him. On the drive home, Smith said, "You were quiet today." "I was listening." "To what?" "Everyone." He glanced at her. "You could have said something." "About what?" He didn't answer. The silence returned. Viola looked through the passenger window at the Dallas streets passing outside. For years she had believed that staying quiet during an uncomfortable moment was sometimes the kindest thing she could do. Now she wondered whether silence was simply making it easier for both of them to avoid what needed to be said. Neither mentioned the property, the money, or the strange distance growing between them anymore. The documents were still on the kitchen counter when Viola came home from work on Thursday. She recognized the property address immediately. There were several pages beneath a folder, along with a contractor invoice and a document she hadn't seen before. She picked it up. Smith walked in behind her. "You're home early." She turned. "What is this?" He looked at the paper. "Nothing you need to worry about." Viola lowered it slightly. "That's not what I asked." Smith put his keys down. "It's paperwork for the property." "What did you sign?" He paused. "Why does it matter?" "Because I live here too." "That doesn't answer my question." Smith walked toward the refrigerator. "It's just part of the financing." "Financing for what?" "The repairs." "How much?" He opened the refrigerator door. "I don't have the final number yet." Viola stared at him. "You already signed something." "I had to move quickly." "You moved quickly without telling me." Smith closed the refrigerator. "I knew this conversation would turn into this." "Into what? An argument?" "I'm not arguing." "You're questioning me." "Yes, exactly." Viola put the document back on the counter. Smith, what did you sign? He looked at the paper. Nothing that puts us in immediate danger. Immediate danger. She repeated the words slowly. What does that mean? It means I handled it. You keep saying that. Because I did. Viola shook her head. No, you made another decision and decided I could be informed afterward. Smith's face tightened. It's my property. Viola looked at him. And our money. I've told you I know what I'm doing. Then why can't you explain it to me? Because every time I explain something you find another reason to question it. Maybe because you keep giving me reasons to ask. The room went quiet. Smith looked away first. For several seconds neither moved. Then he said, I can handle my own finances. Viola's voice became quieter. Then handle your own money. Smith looked back at her. What is that supposed to mean? It means if you want complete control over every decision, you can't keep expecting me to act like nothing affects me. This isn't about control, it feels like it. You're making this bigger than it is. No, she pointed toward the papers. This is exactly as big as it needs to be. Smith shook his head. You know what? I don't want to do this tonight. Neither do I. Then stop. Viola looked at him. I've been stopping. That sentence landed differently. Smith didn't respond. She continued, I stopped asking about the property every time you came home. I noticed. I stopped bringing up the money because I knew you'd get defensive. You were making me defensive, and I stopped telling you when something bothered me because I didn't want another argument. Smith's expression changed. So now this is all my fault? No, Viola shook her head. That's the problem. It's not all your fault. He stared at her. I've avoided conversations too. I've let things go because I thought they'd eventually settle down. Because things don't settle down when nobody actually deals with them. Smith pulled out a chair and sat. For the first time that evening he looked tired rather than angry. Do you still want this marriage? Viola didn't answer immediately. The question seemed too large for the kitchen. Finally she sat across from him. I wanted it. That's not what I asked. I know. Smith waited. Viola rubbed her thumb against the edge of the table. I don't know what I want anymore. Smith swallowed. So that's it? I didn't say that. But you're saying you don't know. I don't know how to fix this. I'll change. She looked at him. When? What? When will things actually change? I can do better. You've said that before, and you never give me a chance. Viola's eyes lowered. I've given you chances. Smith leaned forward. Then give me another one. She looked at him for a long moment. I've been trying. He went silent. Those 4 words carried more weight than any accusation she could have made. She wasn't saying she had done everything right. She wasn't saying Smith was beyond forgiveness. She was saying that she had already spent months trying to preserve something that no longer felt safe enough to discuss honestly. Smith looked down at the documents. For the first time, the papers on the counter seemed less important than the marriage sitting between them. Neither spoke for several minutes. The house was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. Finally, Smith said, Maybe we need some space. Viola nodded slowly. Maybe we do. Neither of them knew that this conversation would become the beginning of the end. There was no slam door, no dramatic accusation. Just 2 people sitting across from each other and admitting, perhaps for the first time, that love alone had not taught them how to live together. And once that admission had been made, neither could honestly pretend they hadn't heard it. The decision to separate did not happen in one conversation. After the night they admitted they needed space, Viola and Smith spent several days moving around each other carefully. They spoke when necessary. They answered practical questions. They still shared the house, but neither pretended the old routine had returned. One evening, Smith sat at the dining table while Viola sorted through a folder of financial documents. So we're really doing this? Viola looked up. I think we have to. Smith nodded slowly. He didn't argue. Neither did she. The next few weeks became less about deciding whether they were still in love and more about figuring out how to separate 2 lives that had become connected in hundreds of ordinary ways. Viola approached the process the way she approached everything else that required organization. She made copies, she reviewed statements, she kept the documents related to their accounts together, she separated personal records from household records, she made notes when something needed clarification. Smith noticed. You're keeping all of that? Yes. Why? Because it's important. He leaned against the doorway. You think I'm going to do something? No. Then why keep copies? Viola looked at him. Because we're separating. Smith didn't have an answer. The practical side of the separation moved forward. There were conversations about accounts, bills, property, and belongings. There were decisions that neither of them enjoyed making. But there was no dramatic battle. That seemed to surprise Smith. He had expected anger. He had expected Viola to fight over the house. He thought she would want the furniture, the television, the things they had bought together. Instead, she seemed more interested in making sure the separation was properly documented. One Saturday morning she began packing. Smith stood near the hallway watching her fold clothes. "How much are you taking?" Viola looked over. "I'm not sure yet." He nodded. She packed 2 suitcases, her clothes, her laptop, a few personal items. Then she went into the kitchen. She opened a cabinet and removed a small recipe box that had belonged to her grandmother. Smith watched. "You're taking that?" "Yes." He almost smiled. "Of course you are." Viola looked at him. "What?" "Nothing." She placed the box carefully inside a bag. Then she took a framed childhood photograph from a shelf. Smith glanced at it. "You want that too?" "Yes." He nodded. "Okay." She returned to the kitchen and picked up a few items she had personally purchased. Nothing expensive. Nothing that would change the appearance of the house. Smith watched her for a while, then he asked, "That's it?" Viola looked around. "What do you mean?" "The furniture, no. The television, no. The couch," she shook her head. "You don't want any of it?" "I don't need it." Smith folded his arms. "You could take some of it. I know." "Then why aren't you?" Viola looked at him for a moment. "Because I don't want to spend the next several months arguing about furniture." "That's not what I meant." "I know." He looked toward the living room. "You're leaving a lot behind." "I know." There was something in his voice that made Viola stop. Smith seemed genuinely confused. He had expected her to fight. Instead, she was walking away, and because he was still measuring the situation through possessions, he didn't understand what he was seeing. "You're really not going to fight for anything?" Viola closed the suitcase. "I don't want to fight. You're just leaving?" "I am." Smith stared at her. "You're okay with this?" Viola looked at the room. The couch was still there. The dining table was still there. The television was still mounted on the wall. The house looked almost exactly as it had before she started packing. But she remembered the conversations that had happened in those rooms, the questions that never got answered, the decisions made without her, the moments when she had stopped speaking because speaking felt exhausting. She looked back at Smith. "I'm okay with leaving." He didn't respond. She picked up her bags. At the front door she paused. For a moment she looked back into the house. There had been good memories here. That mattered too. She wasn't going to pretend the marriage had been nothing but pain. There had been laughter. There had been ordinary mornings. There had been plans they once believed in. But a place could hold good memories and still become a place you needed to leave. Smith stood several feet away. "Viola." She turned. He looked like he wanted to say something. Instead he asked, "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Yes." "You're not taking anything else?" "No." He looked around the house again, then back at her. "All right." Viola opened the door. She stepped outside with 2 suitcases, her laptop, her grandmother's recipe box, and the few personal things she had chosen to carry forward. Smith remained inside. He looked at the furniture, the rooms, the house. Everything was still there. To him, that meant he had kept almost everything. To Viola, none of those things determined whether she had won or lost. She placed her bags in the car. Before getting inside, she looked back once. Smith was still standing in the doorway. Neither waved. Neither smiled. Then Viola got into her car and drove away. Smith closed the door. For a moment he stood in the quiet living room. The house looked full, yet somehow it felt different. He couldn't explain why. He only knew that Viola had left with very little, and because he was still thinking in terms of what could be seen and counted, he believed that meant she had lost. He had no idea how wrong that assumption would become. The apartment was smaller than the house, but on the first morning Viola woke up there, she stayed in bed for several minutes without reaching for her phone. There was no Smith in the next room, no question about what time he would leave, no conversation waiting about the investment property. She finally got up and made coffee. The kitchen was narrow. The living room had only the furniture she had brought with her. 2 suitcases were still partly unpacked. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. Viola sat at the small dining table and opened her laptop. The first thing she checked was her budget. She had done this during the marriage too, but now the numbers felt different. There was no joint account to monitor in the same way, no property payment to accommodate, no conversation about whether another expense should be postponed because Smith needed money for repairs. She looked at her rent, utilities, insurance, groceries, transportation, and savings. Then she adjusted the numbers. Starting over wasn't comfortable, but every number on the screen was hers to understand. She opened another document. Her professional course. She had postponed it during the marriage because there always seemed to be something else that needed attention. A bill, a repair, a household decision, something. She stared at the course information, then she registered. Nobody applauded. She simply felt that she had finally done something she had been putting off for herself. Across Dallas, Smith was waking up in the house they had shared. Most of the furniture was still there. The television remained mounted on the wall. The dining table was still in its place. His routine looked almost unchanged. He went to work. He checked the property. He dealt with repairs. From the outside, people could easily assume he had come through the divorce better than Viola. He had the house. He had the property. He had the larger income. He had almost everything people could see. At work, one of his co-workers asked about Viola. Smith barely looked up from his computer. She left. "Are you two officially done?" "Yeah." The co-worker hesitated. "Did she take much?" Smith leaned back. "Not really." "What did she take?" "Her clothes, her laptop, some personal stuff. That's it?" Smith shrugged. "Pretty much." A few days later, someone asked again. This time, Smith said, she didn't want anything from the house. Then another time, she left with what she came with. The sentence sounded harmless. Smith didn't say it angrily. He simply repeated it whenever the subject came up. Eventually, the wording became shorter. She left with nothing. That version was easier. It required no explanation. It made the divorce sound simple. Smith had kept the house. Viola had left. End of story, except it wasn't. Viola didn't hear the phrase immediately. She was busy learning how to live without arranging her day around another person's needs. She attended her course. She worked. She came home. Some nights she enjoyed the silence. Other nights she remembered something Smith had said, and the quiet became harder. She missed parts of the marriage. That surprised her. She missed certain jokes and the way they used to talk about ordinary plans. But missing someone did not mean she had made the wrong decision. One evening, after class, Viola returned home and placed her keys beside the door. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the message. It was from someone she knew through the marriage. "Are you doing okay?" Viola stared at it. Then another message appeared. "I heard you left with nothing." She stopped. For several seconds she didn't move. The words were not surprising, but seeing them written down made something inside her tighten. She could explain. She could send photographs of receipts. She could open bank statements. She could explain the bills she had managed and the money she had contributed. Instead, she locked her phone and placed it face down on the table. For that night, she chose not to answer. But the message had changed something. Smith's version of the divorce was no longer staying inside his conversations. It was beginning to reach her new life. And Viola had to decide whether protecting her peace was worth allowing someone else's version of the past to remain unanswered. She looked around the apartment once more, then opened her course schedule again. There was work ahead, and she needed to keep moving forward. The message stayed on Viola's phone for most of the evening. "I heard you left with nothing." She read it again. Then she put the phone down. A few minutes later she picked it up. She typed, "That isn't what happened." She stared at the sentence. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Then she deleted it. She tried again. "I left with what belonged to me." Delete again. "I don't think you'd take the photos." But it opened another door. If she sent it, there would be questions. How much did you contribute? What happened with the money? Why didn't you take the furniture? Why did you leave? What did Smith do? Viola knew she could answer those questions. She also knew she would have to answer them again after that. She put the phone down. The next morning the message was still there. She went to work, handled her responsibilities, and tried not to think about it. At lunch, she opened her banking records. She looked at the statements she had kept. There it was, the payments, the household expenses, the transfers. The records didn't need an emotional explanation. They simply showed what had happened. Viola leaned back in her chair. For a moment she imagined sending everything. Not publicly, just to the person who had asked. A few documents, a short explanation. Then she thought about what would happen afterward. That person might tell someone else. Someone else might tell another person. Soon, the divorce would become a conversation she had never wanted. She closed the records. That evening, Viola received another message. "Are you upset with Smith?" She didn't answer immediately. Finally, she wrote, "I don't want to discuss the marriage." She sent it. The response came quickly. "I understand." That was all. Viola set the phone down. It was the first time she realized that she could refuse to explain herself without lying. She didn't have to say Smith was right. She didn't have to say he was wrong. She simply didn't have to participate. A few weeks later, she heard the phrase again. This time, it came from someone who had known them both. They were standing outside a restaurant after a professional gathering. The woman looked uncomfortable. "I hope you don't mind me asking something." Viola smiled politely. "What is it?" "I heard Smith said you left the house with nothing." Viola looked at her. For a second she considered changing the subject. Instead she said, "He did. Is that true?" "No." The answer came quietly. The woman waited. Viola continued, "I left with what belonged to me. But didn't you contribute to the house?" "I contributed to the marriage." The woman nodded. "I thought so." Viola looked away. "What did he mean then?" "I don't know." The woman hesitated. "Doesn't it bother you?" Viola was quiet. "Yes." The woman looked surprised. "Then why don't you tell people what happened?" Viola took a breath. "Because I don't want my life to become a courtroom." "That makes sense. I could prove a lot of things." The woman said nothing. "I kept records. I know what I contributed. I know what happened." "Then why let him say it?" Viola looked at her. "Because proving him wrong doesn't give me my marriage back." The woman lowered her eyes. "And it won't change what happened." "No." Viola paused. "But I also don't want to spend the next 5 years explaining the last 2. That sentence seemed to end the conversation. They stood quietly for a moment. Then the woman said, "I don't know if I could do that." Viola gave a small smile. "I didn't know if I could either." She wasn't pretending the decision was easy. There were still moments when she wanted people to know the truth. There were still moments when Smith's version made her angry. But she had begun to understand the difference between correcting a lie and living inside it. She could correct someone when necessary. She could protect herself financially. She could keep her records. She could tell the truth when the truth mattered. But she didn't have to chase every person who believed Smith's version. That night, Viola returned to her apartment. She placed her keys on the counter and changed into comfortable clothes. Then she sat at her small dining table, the same kind of table where she had once sat with Smith and discussed household expenses. Only now, there was no argument waiting on the other side. She opened her laptop. Her professional course was still there. Her budget was still there. Her plans were still there. She looked at the financial records for a moment. Then she closed the folder. She wasn't throwing the records away. She wasn't pretending the past hadn't happened. She was simply refusing to make the past the center of her new life. For the first time, Viola understood something she hadn't understood during the marriage. Sometimes protecting your peace doesn't mean you have nothing to say. It means you finally decide that not everyone deserves an explanation. And somewhere in Dallas, Smith was still telling people the same story. Viola had left with nothing. He had no idea how much that sentence was eventually going to force him to reconsider what he believed he had actually kept. The first problem with the investment property came in the form of a repair bill. The amount was higher than Smith expected. He stood in the property one afternoon looking at the estimate on his phone. This can't be right. The contractor had explained the cost. Smith understood the numbers. He simply didn't like them. The work had to be done. There was no easy way around it. He paid the required amount and returned home that evening already thinking about what else might go wrong. Then one of the tenants left. The vacancy wasn't permanent, but every empty month meant money Smith had expected was no longer coming in. Another payment arrived late. Then another repair needed attention. None of those problems were impossible to handle, but together they changed the picture. The property was no longer the simple investment Smith had imagined when he had first talked about it with Viola. He opened his laptop one night and began reviewing the property's expenses. He went through invoices, then account transfers, then older statements. He wasn't looking for Viola. He was looking for places where he could cut costs. But after several minutes he stopped. There was a transaction he remembered differently. Smith clicked on it. The amount wasn't enormous, but the account source caught his attention. It hadn't come entirely from his personal funds. Part of the payment had come from the joint account he had shared with Viola. He stared at the screen. Then he checked the statement again. The transaction was there. He opened another record, same information. Smith leaned back in his chair. He remembered telling someone that he had paid for the purchase himself. He remembered saying it confidently. He had believed it. Or perhaps he had simply remembered it the way he wanted to remember it. He closed the laptop. A few minutes later he opened it again. He checked another transaction, then another. The pattern wasn't dramatic. Viola hadn't secretly financed his entire investment. She hadn't been responsible for everything. But neither had Smith. The distinction bothered him. He had always thought of himself as the person carrying the financial burden because he earned more. That part was true, but being the higher earner wasn't the same as being the only contributor. He sat back in his chair. For some reason he remembered Viola at the dining table. "How much is the repair going to cost?" He remembered her asking. He remembered answering without giving her a clear number. He remembered telling her she worried too much. Then another memory surfaced. "I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying don't make the decision with money that belongs to both of us without talking to me first." Smith rubbed his face. At the time he had heard criticism. Now he heard something else. Concern. Not all of her questions had been attempts to stop him. Some had simply been questions a spouse had a right to ask. That realization irritated him. It was easier to be angry with Viola when he believed she had never supported him. It was harder when he remembered the ways she had tried to make the household work. Still, Smith wasn't ready to admit he had been wrong. Not completely. He told himself there were reasons for what he had done. The property had needed investment. He had been trying to build something. He had earned more. He had carried responsibilities Viola didn't always see. All of those things could be true, but another truth could exist beside them. He had made decisions without her. He had moved joint money. He had become defensive when she questioned him. And after the divorce he had reduced the entire marriage to a sentence that made him feel better. She left with nothing. Smith looked at the account statement again. The words suddenly sounded different in his own head. He didn't call Viola. He didn't apologize. Not yet. Instead he closed the computer and walked into the kitchen. The house was quiet. Her chair at the dining table was empty. For a moment Smith noticed something he hadn't noticed before. The house contained almost everything they had owned together. But it no longer contained the person who had remembered all the small things. The bills, the insurance, the birthdays, the maintenance. The details he had rarely thought about because they were usually already handled. He stood there longer than he intended. Then his phone rang. He answered. It was a question about the property. Smith listened. He gave the necessary answer. When the call ended, he placed the phone on the counter. His financial problems were real. His regrets were beginning to become real too. But neither had changed his public story. When someone asked about Viola, he still said the same thing. She left with nothing. What he didn't understand yet was that Viola had never needed to take the furniture to prove she had contributed. She had records, she had memories, she had lived the marriage, and most importantly, she had stopped needing Smith to confirm that any of it mattered. The irony was becoming difficult to ignore. Smith had spent months believing Viola's silence proved his version of the divorce. But the truth was almost the opposite. She stayed silent because she already knew what the records said, and she had decided that proving him wrong was no longer worth giving him another piece of her life. Smith didn't know that yet. He only knew that the story he had been telling people was beginning to feel less comfortable every time he repeated it. The question came on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. Viola had just finished a professional course session when she stopped at a small coffee shop before heading home. She was sitting near the window with her laptop open when someone she knew from the professional gathering approached her. "Can I sit here?" Viola looked up. "Sure." The woman sat across from her. For a few minutes they talked about work. Then the conversation changed. "I've wanted to ask you something." Viola closed her laptop halfway. "Okay. I hope this isn't inappropriate." "That depends on the question." The woman smiled faintly. "It's about Smith." Viola's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for the woman to notice. "What about him?" "I heard what he's been saying." Viola waited. "He tells people you left the house with nothing." Viola looked down at the coffee in front of her. "I know." "You know?" "Yes." "And you never corrected him?" "No." The woman seemed genuinely confused. "Why?" Viola didn't answer immediately. She had asked herself that question many times, not because she didn't know the answer, because the answer had changed. At first, she said, "I wanted to." "What stopped you?" "I was angry." The woman nodded. "I would be too." Viola gave a small smile. "I was angry enough to want everyone to know the truth." "What truth?" "That I didn't just walk away from a marriage with nothing." Viola looked out the window. "I contributed. I paid household expenses. I handled things that Smith didn't always notice. I had records." The woman leaned forward. "Then why didn't you show them?" Viola looked back at her. "Because proving something and healing from it aren't the same thing." The woman was quiet. Viola continued, "I could have shown the statements. I could have explained the accounts. I could have gone through every purchase and every bill." "You would have been telling the truth." "I know." "Then wouldn't that have been fair?" "Yes." Viola paused. "But fair doesn't always mean necessary." The woman frowned slightly. "I don't understand." Viola folded her hands around the coffee cup. "There were things I needed to document because they mattered. Financial records matter. Agreements matter. If you're separating from someone, you shouldn't rely on memory alone." She looked down. "But once those things were handled, I had to decide what I wanted to do with the rest of my life." The woman nodded slowly. "You mean you didn't want to keep talking about him?" "I didn't want to keep talking about us. There was a difference. Viola knew that now. During the marriage, she had spent so much time trying to make things work that she had sometimes forgotten to ask what she wanted. She didn't want the divorce to become another version of that. Another place where her attention remained fixed on Smith. Another situation where his choices determined her next move. "But doesn't his story bother you?" the woman asked. Viola laughed softly. "It does." The answer surprised even her. She didn't pretend otherwise. "Some days more than others." "So why stay quiet?" "Because silence isn't always surrender." The woman waited. Viola continued. "But I also learned something else. Silence isn't always wisdom either." That mattered. She didn't want anyone hearing her story and believing that people should simply endure false accusations. "There are times you have to speak," she said. "If someone is damaging your finances, threatening your rights, or putting something important at risk, you can't just sit quietly because you want peace." The woman nodded. "So what was different here?" Viola looked down at her hands. The marriage was already over. She paused. "I had protected what I needed to protect. I had my records. I knew what happened. I knew what I had contributed." "And that was enough? For me, eventually." The woman smiled faintly. "I don't think I could have done that." Viola smiled back. "I didn't think I could either." She picked up her coffee. "But I realized something." "What?" "If I spent the next 5 years correcting every person who believed Smith's version, I'd still be living inside my divorce." The woman became quiet. Viola opened her laptop again. "I don't want that." The conversation ended there, but the question stayed with Viola after she left the coffee shop. She had spent months believing that silence was simply something she had chosen. Now she understood it more clearly. She wasn't silent because Smith's story was true. She wasn't silent because she had nothing to prove. She was silent because she had finally reached a point where she didn't want her former husband's opinion to decide how much attention her past received. And that was a freedom she had not known how to ask for while she was married. Still, one thing remained difficult. Smith was continuing to tell the story. And somewhere in his own life, the facts were beginning to make that story harder for him to believe. Smith noticed the change in himself before he was willing to admit it. Whenever someone asked about Viola, the sentence still came easily. She left with nothing. But afterward, he sometimes heard how it sounded. Not because anyone challenged him, because he had started challenging himself. The investment property was taking more attention than he had expected. The repairs had cost more. The vacancy had lasted longer. The late payments had made his monthly numbers tighter. He still believed the property could work. That part hadn't changed. What had changed was his confidence that every decision he had made along the way had been as solid as he once believed. One evening, Smith sat at the dining table with several statements spread in front of him. He wasn't searching for anything in particular. He was trying to understand where the money had gone. His eyes moved from one transaction to another. Then he found himself looking at the old joint account again, the same records he had checked before, the same numbers. He knew what they showed. Still, he opened them again. A portion of one property expense had come from the joint account. Another household-related payment had been covered the same way. None of it meant Viola had financed his investment. It didn't. But it did mean the sentence he had been using was too simple. He had told people he had paid for everything. He had told himself that too. Now the records forced him to separate two things he had treated as identical. He had earned more. That was true. He had carried a larger share of certain expenses. Also true. But Viola had contributed. That was true too. Smith leaned back. He remembered how often she had handled things without announcing them. Insurance renewals, bills, maintenance, household paperwork, the small responsibilities that disappeared when someone did them consistently. He remembered one evening when she had asked how much money they would have left if the property needed another repair. He had laughed. "You worry too much." At the time, the comment had seemed harmless. Now it sounded dismissive. Smith closed his eyes for a moment. He wasn't ready to call himself wrong about everything. He still believed Viola had sometimes been too cautious. He still believed she had questioned some decisions more than necessary. He still felt that she hadn't always understood the pressure he carried. Those feelings didn't disappear simply because the record showed he had overstated his contribution. But another thought had become harder to avoid. Maybe he had wanted Viola to trust him so badly that he had started treating questions as insults. Maybe he had confused being responsible for earning more money with being entitled to make every important decision. That thought made him uncomfortable, so he pushed it aside. He gathered the statements and put them back into the folder. The next morning, he went to work. At lunch, someone mentioned the divorce again. "Have you talked to Viola lately?" "No." "You think she's doing okay?" Smith shrugged. "She seems fine." "You two didn't have any big fight over the house?" "No." "What did she take?" Smith almost gave his usual answer. Instead, he paused. "Some personal things." The person nodded. Smith looked down at his food. "She didn't want the furniture." "Lucky you." Smith gave a brief smile. "Yeah, but the word didn't feel as satisfying as it once had." Lucky? Was that what he was? He had the house, he had the furniture, he still had the property, yet he had also spent months managing problems that Viola had once warned him about. He thought about calling her. Not to apologize. Not yet. He wasn't even sure what he would say. He simply wanted to know how she was doing, but he didn't call. He wasn't ready. That evening, he returned home and stood in the living room. The furniture was exactly where Viola had left it. Nothing looked missing. For months, that had comforted him. Now it felt different. He realized that the emptiness he noticed wasn't physical. It was the absence of the person who had once filled the house with small routines he had barely appreciated. Smith walked into the kitchen. He looked at the counter, then at the dining table. He remembered Viola sitting there with her laptop open, asking questions he had found irritating. At the time, he thought she was making everything harder. Now he wondered whether she had simply been trying to make sure they both understood what they were risking. Smith picked up his phone. He opened his contacts. His thumb stopped. Viola's name was still there. He stared at it for several seconds. Then he locked the phone. Not today. He wasn't ready to have that conversation. But something had already changed. For the first time, Smith understood that the woman he had described as leaving with nothing had actually left behind a great deal. Not just furniture. Not just a house. She had left behind responsibilities he had once taken for granted, and he was beginning to understand their value only after they were no longer his to receive. The problem was that he still didn't know what Viola had become without him. He was about to find out. The professional event was held on a Thursday evening in Dallas. Smith almost didn't attend. It had been a long week, and the property had taken more time than he wanted to give it, but one of his colleagues had encouraged him to come, so he changed after work and drove across town. He expected the evening to be ordinary. Then he saw Viola. She was standing near the side of the room with her laptop bag over one shoulder, talking to two people Smith didn't recognize. He stopped walking. For several seconds he simply watched her. She looked different. Not dramatically. She wasn't dressed to attract attention, and she wasn't behaving as though she wanted anyone to notice her. She just looked comfortable. That was what surprised him. Viola laughed at something one of the people said. Then she answered a question about the professional course she had completed. Smith couldn't hear everything from where he stood, but he caught enough to understand that she had taken on additional responsibilities at work. She sounded confident. Not boastful, just sure of herself. Smith looked away. Then he looked back. He hadn't expected that reaction. He had imagined Viola struggling, maybe regretting the divorce, maybe missing the house, maybe wishing she had taken more with her. Instead, she was standing there talking about her own future as though it had always belonged to her. Smith waited several minutes before approaching. When Viola noticed him, her expression changed slightly. "Hi. Hi." Neither smiled immediately. Then Viola gave him a polite smile. "How are you?" "I'm okay. Good." Another pause. Smith looked toward the people she had been speaking with. "You've been busy." "Yeah. You finished that course?" "I did." "When?" "A few weeks ago." He nodded. "That's good. Thanks." The conversation felt strangely formal. These were two people who had once shared a home, a dining table, bills, plans, and ordinary mornings. Now they were standing several feet apart, asking each other how work was going. Smith put his hands into his pockets. "I heard you were doing well." Viola smiled faintly. "I've been trying." The words caught him. He remembered hearing her say something similar during their marriage. He looked at her. "You really never told anyone what happened?" Viola's expression became still. "What do you mean?" "About the divorce." She understood. "You were telling your version." Smith looked down. "I know." "And?" He took a breath. "I guess I figured if you wanted people to know something different, you'd say it." Viola looked at him for a moment. "I thought about it." "Why didn't you?" She didn't answer. Smith continued. "I said things I probably shouldn't have." "You did." He nodded. There was no anger in her voice. That somehow made it harder. "I was angry," he said. "I know. I felt like you walked away and left me with everything." Viola looked at him. "I didn't leave you with everything. You didn't take much." "I know." He looked toward the room. "Didn't that bother you?" Viola's eyes moved back to his. "What? That people thought you left with nothing?" For the first time since he approached her, Viola didn't answer immediately. Her fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her bag. "Yes," she said. Smith seemed surprised. "Then why didn't you tell them?" Viola looked at him. She could have answered quickly. She could have listed the records she had kept. She could have explained the money. She could have reminded him of every conversation at the dining table. Instead, she simply said, "I didn't think I needed to." Smith frowned slightly. "You didn't need to?" "No, but people believed me." "I know." "And you were okay with that?" Viola looked toward the room. For a moment, Smith thought she might walk away. She didn't. She turned back to him. "I wasn't okay with it." Smith waited. "Then why?" Viola took a slow breath. "Because there came a point when I had to decide whether I wanted to spend my life explaining what happened between us." Smith said nothing. She continued. "I had already spent enough time trying to make the marriage work." His eyes dropped. "And I didn't want the divorce to become another thing I had to fight about." Smith nodded slowly. There was something else in her expression. Not defeat, not bitterness, something he couldn't quite name. He wanted to ask. He almost did. But the room around them had become louder, and someone called Viola's name from across the room. She glanced over, then back at Smith. "We should probably let this go." Smith nodded. "Yeah." Viola gave him a small smile. "Take care. You too." She walked away. Smith remained where he was. For the first time, he understood that her silence had never meant she agreed with him. It meant she had made a decision he hadn't understood, and he still didn't know what that decision had cost her. More importantly, he didn't yet know what it had given her. Smith found Viola again near the end of the evening, just before people began leaving. Then he saw her near the entrance, checking something on her phone. "Viola." She looked up. "Yeah? Can I ask you something?" She slipped her phone into her bag. "Sure. When you left the house, did you really not want anything?" Viola understood. "I didn't want the house." "That isn't what I asked." She looked at him. "I didn't want the fight." Smith lowered his eyes. "I thought you were just giving up." "I wasn't." "Then what were you doing?" Viola took a breath. "Leaving peacefully." Smith didn't respond. He had spent months telling himself that Viola's lack of resistance meant she had accepted his version of the divorce. If she believed she deserved more, he thought, she would have fought for it. Standing in front of her now, he realized he had confused restraint with surrender. "You could have taken more," he said. "I know. You could have fought over the furniture." "I know. The house." "I know." Smith looked at her. "Then why didn't you?" "Because I didn't want my last memory of our marriage to be us arguing over things." He swallowed. "That doesn't mean you weren't angry." "I was." "At me?" "Yes. I was angry about the decisions you made without me." I was angry about the money. I was angry that I kept trying to explain why those things mattered, and you kept hearing criticism. Smith looked away. She didn't soften the truth to make him comfortable. But I was also angry with myself. Why? Because I stayed quiet too long. Smith looked back at her. You shouldn't blame yourself for everything. I don't. She paused. But there were conversations I should have had sooner, boundaries I should have made clearer, things I should have stopped accepting. Smith nodded slowly. Then he asked, Did you think I was going to take something from you? No. Then why keep all those records? Because we're adults, Smith, and because marriage doesn't make paperwork unnecessary. I found some of them. I assumed you would. You knew? I knew I had kept them. Smith exhaled. I didn't realize how much you had documented. Viola's expression remained calm. I wasn't documenting you. I was documenting our finances. He remembered how suspicious he had been when she organized statements and receipts. At the time, he had thought she was preparing to fight him. Now he understood that she had been preparing to protect herself, not from revenge, from uncertainty. Smith rubbed his hands together. I did think you left me with everything. I know, and I thought you didn't care. I cared. Then why didn't you tell people? Viola looked at him. Because I didn't want to spend another year explaining why I left. He didn't answer. People can believe I lost. People can believe you won. I can't control that. But it isn't true. No. She looked toward the door. But I don't need everyone to know that. Smith stared at her. That was what he couldn't understand. He had spent months needing people to believe his version. Viola had reached a point where she didn't need anyone's permission to believe her own. I was hurt, she said. I still am sometimes. Smith's face tightened. I know I hurt you. I know you didn't wake up planning to hurt me. He looked at her. That doesn't make it okay. No. She adjusted the strap of her bag. But I don't have to turn you into a terrible person to accept that our marriage was no longer good for me. Smith looked down. He wanted to apologize. The words came slowly. I'm sorry. Viola didn't immediately answer. Then she nodded. Thank you. Nothing dramatic followed. She didn't hug him. He didn't ask her to come back. There was no promise that everything between them would suddenly become easy. There was only an acknowledgement that two people had finally understood something they had failed to understand while married. Viola hadn't left because she had nothing to say. She had left because she had decided that peace was more important than winning an argument that could never restore what they had lost. Smith looked at her one last time. I wish I'd understood that earlier. So do I. Then Viola walked toward the entrance. Smith remained where he was. For once, he didn't try to have the last word. When Viola returned to her apartment that night, she didn't turn on the television. She placed her keys on the counter, set her bag beside them, and stood quietly in the kitchen. The conversation with Smith had not gone the way she expected. She had thought she might feel angry afterward. Instead, she felt tired. Not the kind of tiredness that made her want to sleep. The kind that came from finally saying something you had carried for a long time. Viola poured herself a glass of water and sat at the small dining table. It was the same table where she had reviewed her budget after leaving the house, the same table where she had registered for her professional course, the same table where she had spent evenings wondering whether she had made the right decision. She opened her laptop. Her budget was better now. Not perfect, better. Her emergency savings had begun growing again. Her course was finished. She had taken on additional responsibilities at work. None of those things had happened overnight. There had been mornings when she didn't feel confident. There had been evenings when she wondered whether she was starting over too late. But she had kept going. That mattered more to her now than the size of her apartment. She looked around. There was still not much furniture. The walls were plain. The kitchen was small. Nothing about the place suggested that she had somehow transformed her life into something extraordinary. And she was glad. She didn't need an impressive ending. She needed a life that felt like hers. Viola opened the drawer beside the table. Inside were her financial records. She looked at the folder for a moment before closing the drawer. She didn't need to look at the records tonight. She already knew what they contained. They had served their purpose. They had protected her when she needed protection. But they were not the center of her life. That was something she had learned slowly. During the marriage, she had spent so much energy keeping things organized that she had sometimes forgotten to ask whether she was happy. After the divorce, she had gone in the opposite direction for a while. She had wanted to control everything, every expense, every decision, every plan. Eventually, she realized that control wasn't the same as security either. Security came from understanding her choices and being willing to live with their consequences. She smiled faintly. Smith would probably never understand why she had left the house with so little. For him, possessions were easy to count. A couch had a price, a television had a price, furniture could be divided, a property could be valued, money could be listed on a statement. But what price did you put on finally learning to speak up? What number belonged beside a boundary you should have made years earlier? How much was independence worth? Viola didn't know. She only knew those things mattered. She thought about Smith's sentence again. She left with nothing. For months those words had sounded like an insult. Now they sounded incomplete. She had left without the house. She had left without most of the furniture. She had left without the life they had planned together. But she had also left with experience. She knew what financial conversations needed to look like in a healthy partnership. She knew that trust did not mean ignoring records. She knew that love did not give one person permission to make every important decision. She knew that avoiding conflict could become its own kind of problem. She knew that peace was valuable, but so were boundaries. Most importantly, she knew that her worth could not depend on whether Smith recognized it. Viola closed the laptop. She stood and walked to the window. Dallas was quiet outside. Cars moved along the road. Apartment lights came on in nearby buildings. Ordinary people were going home, making dinner, answering messages, paying bills, and trying to figure out their own lives. Viola smiled. Her life was ordinary too, and that was enough. She didn't need Smith to regret everything. She didn't need his friends to apologize. She didn't need people to announce that she had been right. She didn't even need the story to change. She simply needed to stop allowing the story to control her. Smith had measured what she took from the marriage by what she carried through the front door. Viola had learned to measure it differently. She had not taken everything. She had not needed to. She had taken what belonged to her. And she had carried forward the lessons that would help her build something better. For the first time, nothing no longer sounded like an accusation. It sounded like a question. What does a person really need to carry when they leave a life that no longer fits? Viola finally knew her answer. Not everything, just enough to begin again. The next morning, Viola woke before her alarm. For a few seconds she stayed still, listening to the quiet apartment. Then she reached for her phone. There was no message from Smith. She wasn't disappointed. That surprised her. A few months earlier she might have wondered whether he was thinking about the conversation, whether he regretted what he had said, or whether he was finally beginning to understand. Now she simply got out of bed. She made coffee, she opened her laptop, and she went to work. Her life had become ordinary again. That was something she had once been afraid of. After the divorce, she had thought rebuilding would require some dramatic proof that leaving had been the right decision. It didn't. There was no sudden promotion that changed everything. No unexpected money. No moment when everyone who had doubted her came back to apologize. There was simply one morning after another, one responsible decision after another, one boundary held when it would have been easier to give in. That was how her life changed. Smith's life changed differently. He remained in the Dallas house. He continued managing the investment property. Some months were easier than others. The property eventually stabilized enough for him to breathe, but the experience had changed the way he looked at financial decisions. He still liked taking risks. He still believed ambition mattered. But he no longer confused confidence with certainty, and he stopped telling people that Viola had left with nothing. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't gather everyone together and confess that his old version had been unfair. He simply stopped saying it. When someone mentioned the divorce, he became more careful. She took her personal things, he would say. Sometimes he added, we both moved on. It wasn't a dramatic apology, but it was different. Viola never knew exactly when he stopped. And eventually she stopped wondering. That was the real change. She no longer needed to know what Smith thought. She no longer checked whether people believed her. She no longer felt compelled to defend every part of the past. She had learned that there were times when speaking was necessary. If your finances are at risk, document them. If someone is making decisions that affect you, ask questions. If a boundary matters, say it clearly. If your rights are involved, protect them. Peace should never require a person to abandon common sense. But there are also moments when the truth has already been protected, and the remaining battle is only about being understood by people who may never understand. That was the battle Viola chose to leave behind. She didn't forgive Smith because he had earned complete forgiveness. She didn't forget what happened. She simply stopped carrying his opinion around with her. One evening, months later, Viola sat at the same small dining table. Her laptop was open, her budget was balanced, her savings had grown, she had another professional goal written on a sheet of paper beside her. She looked at it and smiled. Then she placed the paper beside the laptop. For a moment, she thought about the house, the dining room, the couch, the television, the conversations, the day she had walked out with 2 suitcases. She remembered Smith asking, "That's it?" At the time, she hadn't known what to say. Now she did. Yes. That was enough. She hadn't needed the couch. She hadn't needed the television. She hadn't needed to empty the house to prove she had mattered inside it. She had needed to leave with enough clarity to build another life. And she had. That was the part Smith had never understood. He had counted what stayed behind. Viola had counted what she could finally carry forward, her judgment, her experience, her financial awareness, her boundaries, her confidence, her peace, and the freedom to make decisions without constantly wondering whether someone else would approve. The woman who once sat at the dining table trying to convince her husband that partnership required communication was no longer waiting for someone to agree with her. She had learned to trust her own judgment, not perfectly, not every time, but enough. And perhaps that was the real lesson. Sometimes people think winning means leaving with more money, more property, more furniture, more proof. But life doesn't always measure victory that way. Sometimes winning is leaving a situation without allowing it to define who you become afterward. Sometimes healing means refusing to spend another year arguing with a person who is no longer part of your daily life. And sometimes the strongest answer to a false story is not another argument. It is the life you build after you walk away. Viola never corrected Smith because she had nothing to say. She stayed silent because she had finally learned that her worth did not depend on getting everyone to agree with her version. She had not walked away with everything. She had not needed to. She walked away with what belonged to her, and then she built something Smith could never have given her, a life where she no longer had to prove that she deserved to be valued. So if you were Viola, what would you have done? Would you have corrected Smith's story and shown everyone the records? Or would you have chosen the same silence and protected your peace? There is no easy answer. But perhaps that is why this story matters, because sometimes the truth needs to be spoken. And sometimes, after you have protected what truly matters, the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining yourself and start living. If this story gave you something to think about, leave your thoughts in the comments, share it with someone who may need to hear this message, and subscribe to Mr. Wisdom Stories for more stories about relationships, choices, consequences, and the lessons we sometimes learn too late.